Hey there, welcome back to Authors Alcove. I am your host, Agnes Wolfe, fantasy writer and your co-pilot through the 52-week Story Savvy self-editing journey, where we take your good story and make it a great one. I get the privilege of interviewing and really picking Rebecca Hartwell's brain. She is the developmental editor with Hart Bound Editing. I strongly recommend her as a developmental editor, especially if you are into fantasy, especially romantasy. I'm a middle grade fantasy writer, but she did an excellent job. She knew the genre. Definitely recommend her for that as well. Today, in episode 12, we're talking about fact checking your fiction, how to make your magical worlds believable, your research productive, and your historical bodices tear-offable. She actually mentions that in the episode, how you need to make sure you know how a bodice is. And so we're talking all about research. But first, I want to do a quick update about Authors Alcove Spring Giveaway. So you can actually enter to win The Breeding by Avili Jerome. I had a great interview with her. She was so fun to talk to. Strongly recommend listening to the episode. Really fun. This is her book. It's a fast-paced dystopian fantasy where survival comes with a cost. I have actually begun reading this and it is super good. I'm really excited to finish it. It's one of our featured titles through May 31st. You can find that over at authorsalcove.org. Anyway, all right, let's get into the actual episode. So this was pre-recorded because nothing throws a reader off more than not getting your facts right. We're going to talk about research here, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Welcome to Authors Alcove for Fantasy Writers. This is episode 12 of the Story Savvy series, where Rebecca, a developmental editor with Hart Bound Editing, is helping me self-edit my good story into a great one. If you haven't already, I encourage you to like and subscribe to the podcast. You can also join the Authors Alcove community on Patreon or check out the new membership site, authorsalcove.com. Last week, we went over creating effective antagonists, which I found very fascinating. Today, we're going to talk about fact-checking our fiction stories, especially in the self-editing phase. Welcome, Rebecca.
Hello. I am happy to be here as always, and I am excited today to tackle plugging fact and reality plot holes in genre fiction. By the end of this episode, you will hopefully feel confident identifying where you need to do more research or shore up your facts, how and where to do that research, and how to apply what you find or choose not to.
So I wanted to start off by asking, at what stage should we begin our research?
Ideally in the planning and plotting stage, but if you are past that at this point or a pantser, then my recommendation is not too early on in the editing process. I ordered this topic in this series where I did, because this is where I suggest you do this step in your self-editing process. So generally somewhere between any huge plot or character level reworking, which is perhaps less objective, kind of depends on how you approach that. But before you end up having to tweak or shift some of your plot points based on the research that you do in your research checks and your fact checks.
So what if we already know a lot about a topic? How would we know that maybe we need to research it a little further?
Sometimes the point isn't just to get facts correct, but also to explain it to the reader if it's not common knowledge. I've been guilty of this in my own work. I have edited quite a few books that you could tell the author was super knowledgeable about something, but weren't great at remembering that their audience probably wasn't. And I've gotten really good feedback about that from my external readers, so beta readers, dev readers, whatever I've got working with me. So doing a few minutes of research, even on stuff that you already know a lot about, can help you gauge whether or not it's common knowledge, and if you feel the need to explain it, how you might do so with maximum clarity and brevity.
So I remember us having a conversation way back when, and you know quite a bit about horses. And I remember you talking about how this particular book that we had read there was some distracting information in that particular book. I don't know, looks like you remember which book that it was.
Yeah.
Um, but as authors, I think we all have some blind spots about what we truly know and what we don't actually know. How can we help find those facts that we might think we know more than we do about?
Great question. Yeah, that's definitely for starters, that's one of my niches. Horses are one of my niches. Um, the cheap answer to your question is outside feedback. Even casual readers can really help with catching those spots, and that's part of why I always recommend you have multiple beta readers or alpha readers or whatever you decide to use. And there are also topic experts like I am on horses or historical clothing who specialize on their niches and can go through your book and not only spot where the issues are, but do that research for you and correct them so that you're going to be accurate with a lot less effort on your part. I know that it's a huge thing in police procedural, for example. That whole genre is pretty well known for having retired police officers, for the most part, just on speed dial to call them up and be like, "Hey, is this how police procedures actually work? Because that is my genre. The people who are reading my books, I know are going to care about this topic. I need your help." So outside feedback is the easy answer there. If you are just doing this on your own, so if you don't have the option of outside feedback, then one of the options that you have is to check through some reader groups, ideally specific to your genre, your subgenre, and see what people are complaining about inaccuracies around. Google might also be able to help with this too, but once you find those common complaints or topics to check, like anatomy or horse riding are two of the most common ones that I've seen, then do a quick glance through your book to see where you mention that topic, flag those, and just double check using whatever research tool you want to, that a 5-minute Google search isn't going to contradict you, that you are at least making some attempt to get that correct. And again, as I'm sure you've heard in research advice, your local library is definitely a resource to bear in mind as well.
So, doesn't writing fantasy kind of get me out of having to do all this research if it's magical?
Uh, yes and no. That was certainly my hope when I started writing fantasy. It didn't turn out that way. There are still rules to the world. Your world, any world that you read or write, you just get to establish what they are and where they do or don't match reality that we live in or know from history, which is always going to be the default when a reader starts reading. So some things, like how horses and tack and writing work, tend to be true to any reality, regardless of how you're writing it. Uh, just as one example of places where fantasy doesn't get you out of it. The advice of know the rules before you break them very much applies here. And more than that, it's very helpful to your readers if they know the rules of your world before your magic system starts breaking them, however closely or distantly that mix ends up happening.
I know actually some of the feedback I got from you on my own, it was some of the world building, and because like mine is very kind of a vague like pre-technology era.
Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts on that? Do I need to choose a time frame and research it, or can it be just vague?
I recommend that you pick some form of starting point reality, and that's often picking a decade and a location from history, if you're not writing modern. Everything post apes living in trees, and even them to some extent, is a technology level. You can't really say pre-technology because humans have always had technology. It might have been Stone Age technology or Bronze Age technology or early medieval, but they had some form of technology, and your reader is going to make assumptions around that. A big part of this is immersion. You want to immerse your readers in smells and sights and sounds and the scale and style of their village, and establishing, hey, this is set in 10th century Romania is a shorthand to give them so much of that immersion. Another consideration is that when you establish something like this, and you don't have to say it's set in 10th century Romania, but if you give them some idea like, hey, this is roughly medieval or roughly Victorian or roughly 1980s, that is going to allow them to make so many more correct assumptions without you having to tell them. If you set some sort of baseline, then when you mention something and don't give details, they can make correct assumptions about what you intended or what they should be picturing, that sort of thing. Clearly knowing what rule base you are starting at before breaking them with the fantasy parts is needed. Um, if you want to take your fantasy world way outside of anything that has actually existed, you still need to have a starting point. So specifics and details are immersive. Picking an answer can help with so many things without you having to think about them or research them or explain them, like what people are wearing or how they're getting around and how they are eating and everything else. So for all of these reasons, I personally highly recommend that you pick a starting point before building your world on it.
That was actually one of the things that I realized when I was reading your feedback, because you had mentioned these things, and I had a vision of but I was not portraying what I was envisioning. And it made me realize, I'm not necessarily doing research on like a particular era, but research on how other fantasy novels
Sure.
actually portray that particular thing. Because when I was creating my world, I did not realize I was doing this, but I chose some of my favorite books and that was the era. And so I realized, oh, maybe one of the things I need to do when I'm doing some of that world building for it to make sure that it's more consistent and that I'm giving my readers a visual is actually rereading some of those books that are set in the same like time frame that I had
Right.
in my head when I had written that.
And it doesn't have to be super specific. Like you don't have to base it on 1892, but basing it in, the late Victorian might be helpful. Or for a lot of high fantasy, early medieval or high medieval is totally acceptable. You don't need to narrow it down further than that, but it needs to be that narrow, if that makes sense.
Yes. So another thing for me, because I write with mythical creatures, but I often take the concepts of others. And so how much work research should we actually do for like mythical creatures or things like that that are not fully based in reality?
In my opinion, only enough to make sure that you aren't using a certain term in a confusing way. So, for example, if you were trying to call small cat-like pixies ogres in your world building, that would be very confusing. But beyond that, the fun for you and the reader is making up your own unique rules and details for your story in your world around those things. I I'll be honest, I see this question a fair bit in a lot of my reader or writer groups, and kind of laugh when I see people asking things like this, because it seems to imply that they think that there's some universal encyclopedia out there. Like you can go to a dictionary and look up exactly what an aardvark is. They think that there's some overruling guideline about what vampires are and what gnomes are and all of this kind of stuff, and there isn't. And like I said, the point is to let your creativity come through in these things. While it's good to know what's expected from like genre expectations, or vampires kind of have to have a thing for blood. That's what makes them a vampire. As well as knowing what's being overdone, so that you don't fall into just recycling a very tired version of that. Then yeah, taking creative liberty and make believe and doing whatever you want with these things, I think is exactly what you should do.
So I know there are certain things that I have strayed away from, but so my question is, when referencing other time periods or different cultures specifically, how can we be assured that we are portraying it in a respectful way?
Great question. So at the most basic, just spend some time researching those aspects, be it LGBTQIA representation or Black characters featured in a book written by a non-Black author, really heavy or traumatic topics, or anything else. In this case, I specifically suggest doing so through books rather than on the internet and from resources in either place written by people inside that culture rather than on the outside looking in. There are also groups that you can bring questions to, like the Facebook groups Writing with Social Awareness or Free Emotional Labor Club. They are both fantastic. I recommend them for this. I specifically suggest using those groups search function within that group and reading through what others have already asked and answered about a particular topic rather than asking the same question afresh, which those groups have already addressed dozens, if not hundreds of times. Lastly, on this topic, sensitivity readers are a thing. You can find those for free or as a paid service. I have used one for my own work because I was writing about a trans secondary character and I wanted to make sure that I was doing that respectfully as someone who isn't trans. Um, and again, it's important to find readers who not only just specialize in that area of cultural sensitivity or identity sensitivity or whatever else you're working with, but ideally who are members of that group rather than someone who has studied it from the outside.
I definitely agree with that, like the sensitivity readers and things like that. Like even so, I have an adopted daughter.
Mm.
And one of the things that when I was early on writing some nonfiction stuff, a lot of people wanted me to write from, like an adoptive parent. And the one thing I realized is I can't write from an adoptive child's point of view
Ah,
because I'm not an adopted child.
sure.
And having raised one, I realized that there is a lot of things that I don't think people especially like even in like foster being a foster parent, that which I was an adoptive parent, there's certain things that you are not aware of because you're not there, because
Sure.
you can't be. You can ask your child. And I think that as a writer we just need to be very curious and compassionate, and we need to be willing to ask the questions, and sometimes they can be hard questions to ask.
Yeah, and I will say on this topic, not directly related to this episode topic, but um, there's a difference between trying to write the stories of someone who you don't belong to their group and representing them. So the classic example that I've seen is it's great to include people of color in your stories as a white author. That representation matters, but you're probably not in a position to write a story about living in the world as a person of color if you aren't that group. So that's a line that I see some authors getting mixed up with, especially on the sensitivity front. So you don't have to, be queer to write about a cast that includes queer characters. But if you want to write a story about being a queer person in a world that isn't accepting of that and finding queer love, then you might need to take pause and reconsider.
So, back to some of the other questions. What are the biggest mistakes authors do when they do actually take the time to do the research? Do they add too much detail, yet it seems off? One thing I have been thinking of as we're talking about this is I read somewhere that they did some research, and people who are in the bottom 20% of knowledge on something tend to think they are in the upper portion. Those that are in the top 20% tend to think that they are in the 50 percentile of.
Mm,
So we often don't know what we don't know. So
yeah.
I'm bringing that up, but then my actual question is, I'm going to just rephrase it. What are the biggest mistakes authors do when they do actually do take the time to do research?
Yeah. I did actually know the term for that phenomenon at some point. I can't think of it at the moment, but oh my lord, I have experienced so much frustration in my life because of it. So to answer the question specifically, first and foremost, trying to find a way to use all of this cool information, these lovely little factoids that you've collected, regardless of how relevant or important they actually are, is the number one mistake. So, second to that, not assessing how much a research topic actually has value in their genre and how much those genre specific readers are going to care about it is another mistake that I commonly see. For example, while blood typing or fingerprints might be fascinating in a medical drama or a police procedural, in contemporary romance, the likelihood of it not seeming weird or boring or unnecessary is pretty slim. So, for example, historical romance readers want all of the clothing details. They want to hear about the corsets and the feathers and the coaches and all of these things. However, in sci-fi, readers want to go deep into tech and aliens and different planets. And both of those special interests and spaces for these details will lose your readers in most gritty thrillers. So knowing what people want you to go into detail about or would be accepting of you going into detail about is important. The third mistake that I commonly see is I believe it's a mistake when authors don't consider removing the mention of the things being researched completely, as an option. So sometimes, and probably more often than new authors think, when your options are either going to be providing a fair bit of detail and description to make something make sense or remove it, the the right option might be just to take it out completely rather than putting in half a page to explain your choice to include it or exactly how you did. The fourth mistake is making too much or too many excuses for themselves and the research that they're doing. For example, if your climax hinges on your protagonist using binoculars to see something, then you really need to set your story in a time or at least a technology level that has already invented binoculars and also had them around long enough that your protagonist in whatever situation that they're in has access to them. So it's not like this, obscure thing that five people have a pair of. Saying, "Oh, it's only, 50 years before the invention of binoculars. It's close enough," isn't gonna cut it with your readers, and especially in historical fiction, your readers are history buffs. Like, you can't really get around that, and, using the hat pin craze, 40 years early is not gonna cut it with your readers kinda thing. Um, Again, like, just consider what your genre is into, what they are open to, and respect your readers in that regard, I think is what I want to say here. So, fifth and the mistake that I am most guilty of on this point is getting off topic by chasing down rabbit holes and side topics and using that as an excuse to let my forward momentum in editing completely drop off, and I've wasted a whole day. So not a mistake on the story front, but definitely on the trying to get things done front. Lastly, be careful about your character voice and tone when adjusting things based on your research. If you aren't careful about this, you can end up with, for example, like a Cockney cabbie in 19th century London sounding like an astrophysicist, which does not make sense. But he mentioned something about a supernova, and now you need to explain what that is to your reader through him, and that doesn't make sense in his voice. So that can be really off putting and worth bearing in mind.
Thank you. I think a lot of what is about respecting, like a lot of what you're talking about is making sure you're respecting the reader
Yep.
and what they're
And the material
expecting.
that you're writing about, too. You want to
Yes.
respect the topics that you are presenting.
And what they're expecting too. Like, because, I'm not going to care as much about like a multiverse because I'm not reading about time. I'm not a big into time travel. But whereas somebody who's reading sci-fi, they're going to be really into wanting to know all the little things about all the different ways the universe can go and consequences. But anyway, I do need to wrap up. I did want to ask one last question. Is it possible to do too much research, which you kind of just said something about that? Where's the balance between not doing enough research and getting totally bogged down in it past the point where the time and effort is no longer worth it?
Your genre is going to have some impact on this. Fantasy, probably one end of the spectrum where you have to do minimal amount. Historical romance, stuff like police procedurals, probably more than any other genre. But as a general rule of thumb, I recommend a 5-minute rule per moment or mention for the most part. So if it's one mention of, oh, they got on their horses and rode to their new house, spend 5 minutes on how you would attach luggage to a horse. Or one mention of, oh, he ripped her bodice off and they made, passionate love or whatever. Spend 5 minutes researching whether the dresses of that time and place open to the front or the back. So 5 minutes can get you a lot of leeway with your readers in most genres. If it's a global aspect, so your whole world building is based on this time or place or culture that you don't belong to, so you need to research, then do as much as you feel you need to without doing so much that that research and those facts overshadow the story that you are being told. So do as much as you need to fill it out and make it vibrant and concrete and all of these things. But if it starts reading like a dissertation on this culture, you've probably gone too far and you need to dial it back and decide that you've probably done enough there for the moment. Um, there's a lot of Goldilocks zone in there, but bearing in mind what your priorities are and what your genre priorities are is going to make a big difference. It shouldn't take you too long to decide if a research topic of a small moment falls into one of these categories that I'll list in a second, all of which are finite and with a Goldilocks zone. For most of my readers, I expect these are some great just little things to bear in mind when you're doing these moments of research to keep things productive. Number one, just scrap the mention because explaining it or getting it right isn't worth it. That is one of the options that your 5 minutes of research might fall into. Option two is you found the right term, wording, or statistic, and you don't need to dwell on it. You've got it right, move on. Option three is you've gotten stuck on it and you just need to flag that spot and mull it over before doing another 5 minutes of research when you circle back around to it, because sometimes things just need to simmer. Option four is doing the research and deciding that this research, this topic, this one spot deserves more in-depth research, in which case you should budget more time to it, more than the 5 minutes, but not leave it totally open-ended so that you don't end up winding down too many rabbit holes. So if you decide it needs more than 5 minutes, that's fine, but tell yourself you have 1 hour to research this, to avoid falling into the whole day wasted, like I mentioned earlier, that I'm very guilty of myself. And yeah, if pretty much any research that you're doing should take about 5 minutes, and if it doesn't, it'll fall into one of those categories, and you can decide where to go from there.
Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate how you let me pick your brain. I really appreciate it.
Yes. Next week, we will return to plot and character arcs to talk about emotional rise and fall and how that directly translates into pacing, the all important pacing. For now, I want to thank everyone following along with this series. You can help us out by liking and subscribing to the Hart Bound Editing podcast and the Authors Alcove podcast, which I highly recommend, where you can find lots more content for fantasy authors and readers beyond this joint series.
I can't wait to start talking about pacing. Thank you very much.